Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the moderator of your next session, Latika Bourke. And I will show you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Latika Bourke. I'm a writer-at-large for the Australian publication The Nightly. I'm based in London. And it's my great pleasure to host this discussion this morning about the EU, NATO and the Indo-Pacific and what we can all achieve together. To debate this topic, please welcome Theresa Fallon, founder and director, Centre for Russia, Europe, Asia Studies in Brussels. Pavel Fischer, member of the Czech Senate and chair of the Czech Parliament's Foreign Affairs, Defence and Security Committee. Nathalie Loiseau, MEP and Committee on Foreign Affairs in the European Parliament. And my very good friend and compatriot, Bryce Wakefield, Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. So I think to get us started, Nathalie, what does the European Union want from the Indo-Pacific, and how successful are they in achieving these goals to date?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Can we ignore the Indo-Pacific? We did for some time, and of course it was not reasonable. We cannot, because of prosperity, growth, supply chains come from Indo-Pacific massively to Europe. Security and rules-based order. We considered for years that the status quo should be taken for granted. We know now, from experience and maybe from what's happening in Ukraine, that nothing can be taken for granted. And if we enjoy peace and stability in Indo-Pacific, we should play our part in keeping it for the future and not consider that it would not be rational for some regional powers to use force. Especially authoritarian regimes don't have the same rationale as democracies have. And protection of the planet is also something that we are quite good at within Europe, but if we don't make progress elsewhere, and especially in Indo-Pacific, let's forget about it. So yes, we should be more involved, and yes, we started talking. We are very good at talking. Indo-Pacific strategies, the national French strategy, national German strategy, national Dutch strategy, and at the end of the day, EU strategy. And when we have a paper, we are done. We are so proud that we managed to have a paper. But that's when reality comes. What can we do? What should we do, and how should we do it? We are small compared to a region going from the east coast of Africa to the Western Pacific Ocean. Does it mean that we have to leave it to the US? Certainly not. If we want the US to remain involved in Europe, and we need it, we have to play our part in Indo-Pacific. We did some good things, for instance, fighting piracy in the Indian Ocean. It was NATO, it was the EU, it was some regional powers like Japan and Korea. Can you imagine right now fighting piracy and traffics and terrorism in the Indian Ocean? There is an operation at Atlanta, quite a successful one, where we team up with Japan and Korea, but the UK is not present because of Brexit. Does it look ridiculous? I guess it does. We have to work on things like coordinated maritime presence. It's one of the acronyms we love in the EU, but it simply means that there has to be a naval presence in places of interest, be it French, UK, US, whoever, but someone has to be present on a permanent basis and rotating. This is feasible, this is achievable. And being French, we also learned from experience, because we have territories, we have citizens, and we have huge challenges in New Caledonia and Polynesia, that Indo-Pacific is not only a game between the US and China, it's also a game for other authoritarian regimes, playing with hybrid warfare. We saw it in New Caledonia, where Azerbaijan is paying attention. Azerbaijan in New Caledonia, what does this mean? It means that this low-cost sort of warfare is going on everywhere. So we have to try to protect democracies, and Taiwan is the biggest challenge of all. We have to make sure that status quo can still be protected. We have to deter the use of force. And sorry to be repetitive, because I know I said it in Bratislava last year, and I say it everywhere. The only way to be relevant, the only way to be credible, the only way to have the rest of the world forget about the biggest blow we had in Afghanistan and believe that the West can be trusted is to help Ukraine win. Because other authoritarian regimes might be deterred to go against the democracy, and because all resolved to support our partners and allies would be credible.
Pavel, let's go to you. Do you think that it is more likely that we will see individual state-to-state agreements, cooperation, work in a more tangible way than the EU or NATO can achieve?
No, I think that we have to be very clear that we are interconnected. We are interconnected in terms of market, we are interconnected in terms of prosperity, and we are interconnected in terms of security. And I think that the very prosperity of a European state is impossible without prosperity of the EU as a whole, and without a strong partnership or ties across the Atlantic. Transatlantic cooperation is something that works. It works not only in market terms, but first of all in security terms. And I think that this is something that we are stemming from our freedom, our sense of sovereignty and sense of belonging and our security. And similarly, we are interconnected with Indo-Pacific. So we can just not play as if there is not our allies and partners in Indo-Pacific. And we cannot forget that, for instance, China is pushing Russia to continue the war. So our own problem at home in Europe is connected already to Asia right now. Without this lifeline that Beijing gives to Russia in terms of financial help or economic cooperation or backing the activities within the Security Council of the UN, we wouldn't ever have such a long war on the European soil. So this connectedness is something that we have to start from, and I think that we should do much more. Yes, as members of NATO, Czech Republic has a very strong tool to cooperate with the United States. But is there any NATO in Indo-Pacific right now? I don't see it come in. And we need it desperately right now, because China is pushing the first chain of islands, be it Japan, be it Philippines, be it South China Sea and Taiwan, in a way which is more and more aggressive. And we are not ready to respond collectively, jointly, in a synergy which is needed. So I hope that the new European Commission should deliver much more than before. Yes, the European Parliament made a good job, but we need now to execute.
Bryce, Wakefield, do you think the Pacific region would welcome an expanded NATO into the Indo-Pacific in any way?
So there are complications with that, I think. I mean, I think NATO does a very good job in the Indo-Pacific, and its approach at the moment is basically to work with, in particular, 4 partners, Japan, South Korea, Australia and New Zealand, on issues like countering misinformation and cyber attacks and things like that. It's not really what I would call a geostrategic. Well, it is geostrategic in a way, but it's not looking in a sense the Indo-Pacific, as it were, as a geostrategic entity, is not really the focus per se. These are issues that happen outside earth, land, and sea, and the cybersphere, if you will. And this is very good. I'm a little bit, skeptical is not the right word, but I think we might be asking a little bit too much of Europe to play a hardcore military role in the Indo-Pacific. So yes, absolutely, there is integrated deterrence happening around the Philippines, Singapore, Australia, Japan, and with the assistance of the United States, of course. Europe has, at best, a secondary role in those, and NATO in particular has a secondary role in those conflicts, I think.
Theresa, Fallon, one of the complaints we hear a lot from our region is the EU wants to impose its ideals a lot on countries it wants to work with or begin cooperation where it hasn't in the past. Is this something that's a problem for Europe?
I'd just like to pick up on a couple of points that the other panelists mentioned. I live in Brussels now for about 20 years, interrupted by time in Russia for 4 years and living in China for 4 years. And so you cannot understand how these two giant bureaucracies, both working and living in Brussels, NATO and the EU, did not have many conversations. They were like two giant elephants that never met. And so now, I mean, it took the war in Ukraine really to focus minds, and I think there are over 134 dialogues. And yes, I know it's a lot of talk, but this is a massive change. So we really have to recognize that, and I think it's important. Because one thing that NATO can't do, and which we're discovering now in Europe, is how deep the Chinese penetration is. For example, in strategic ports, in vital infrastructure. So EU and NATO don't overlap completely, right? So Norway's not a member of the EU. The EU has 4 neutral countries that aren't a member of NATO. They might have some partnership agreements, but so that it's not a perfect fit. But nevertheless, this can be, it's very, very important to wake up everybody about this malign influence activity. And NATO has set out some rules and regulations that they would like EU member states to follow. So there has to be some sort of organization and cooperation with each other. For example, on port management, on strategic infrastructure. We saw what happened with Huawei. Even in Germany now, it's still not clear. They still are deeply penetrated by Huawei. So I think that there needs to be an awakening. So I would say there are 3 clear points we really have to follow. And it's 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning, and I'm so happy to see this many people at an event talking about EU, NATO, and Indo-Pacific, because I think most people are like, what is that? Is that a word salad? How are they connected? What's going on? But it's so important because what happens, we do know that there's an interconnection. And I listened to Ursula von der Leyen's speech yesterday morning very carefully, and I know these things are written by committee. They're all very, very carefully put together. And the one thing that really struck me was that she didn't use the term Indo-Pacific. Now, for a long time, it was taboo to say Indo-Pacific in Brussels. Like, I organized a conference once, and all these people had agreed to come, and then one by one, they gave me phone calls and wouldn't tell me why. They're just like, I'm sorry, I can't come. It was because it was called Indo-Pacific, and no one was allowed to attend or talk about the Indo-Pacific because it was deemed as, heavily laden luggage, this identification of language. And over time, it became acceptable to talk about the Indo-Pacific. Even here in the Czech Republic, a landlocked country, during the EU Council presidency that the Czech Republic had, they hosted a major event here on the Indo-Pacific with all foreign ministers of the EU and other players in the Indo-Pacific. So I think that was a really remarkable symbol. But we need more than symbols. So first of all, EU must recognize Russia-China cooperation. I think that we saw that in the NATO communique that just came out last month. But it's very sticky. I think many people are deeply ambivalent about this. And in Brussels, Joseph Borrell spoke at a conference recently, and I sat in the front row with the red jacket on. He couldn't avoid me, raised my hand, and made sure I only asked one question to make sure he would answer it. And so I asked him, why is everyone continuing to ask Xi Jinping to use his so-called influence on Putin to end the war in Ukraine? I mean, they've been doing this for almost 3 years, and the result is always the same. So I think at one point they really have to understand they don't have a lot of agency, and that Russia-China cooperation is something they really have to acknowledge, and also the sale of dual-use goods, drone equipment, and other precursors for military equipment for Russia that helps to continue the war in Ukraine. The second point I'd like to make is that China, I mentioned earlier, they have to come up with some sort of strategy to protect better Europe in regard to Chinese penetration, which they couldn't believe how lucky they were. I remember on one of my wedding anniversaries, we went to Genoa, and I'm like, oh, I really want to go to the port. Yeah. And I had negotiated with this very sweet woman who agreed to take my whole family out on a boat, and we looked around the port, and we started chatting. She's Italian, very friendly, and she said, for about 15 years, the Chinese tourists have been coming here. And she said, I just thought they were like looking to, it was a boondoggle, they were just coming here as tourists, have a good time, visit Venice, visit Sicily, have a nice holiday. But she said, now I really understand. They were serious about port infrastructure, and they had been looking at it for 15 years, posing as tourists. So I think that there has been a slow awakening, and it's important to really move more quickly. And we need EU-NATO cooperation on that. And lastly, we really need to understand that if there is a problem in the Indo-Pacific, Europe has to be ready for all the equipment that the US will have to move out of this theater to the Indo-Pacific, that they will have to have refuelers. It won't mean brigades, but they'll have to have the necessary equipment, and they need to make those investments now and quickly. So they need to be prepared. So if you want peace, you really do have to prepare for war.
Okay, there's a lot in that, but I think one of the assumptions you're making is that the Indo-Pacific has enjoyed the same awakening that maybe you're experiencing in Brussels. Bryce Wakefield, I want to come back to you. What exactly are we talking about when we talk about Indo-Pacific? Because there is a broad range of views within the region about some of these things that I think a lot of us in the room would have very clear views on, i.e. Ukraine.
Yeah, okay, thanks very much for the question. That requires a very short and tight answer, I guess. Look, there's always a danger when you give somebody who lives in Australia this question that they'll end up claiming that Australia invented the Indo-Pacific. And that's actually correct. I mean, the term had been around for some time, but it was in the Defence White Paper of 2008, I think, that the term was first used in a sort of official sense, if you disregard uses in the 1930s and whatnot by Germany. Yeah, I mean, as you have said, there are different actors who see the Indo-Pacific quite differently, and the Indo-Pacific as a concept has changed over time. When Australia was using it, it was a simple expression of what geostrategic realities for Australia were. A much greater focus on the maritime, reflecting the sort of increases in trade flows through Australia's northern regions. And it was inclusive. I mean, it actually sort of included China as a helpful partner in the region. Of course, this was before 2016 and the tensions that came along with that. And since then, it sort of gravitated to a more Japanese-American, let's say, understanding of the Indo-Pacific as one which is sort of more aimed at China, more aimed at dealing with problematic behavior. It's no surprise that Japan's Indo-Pacific strategy was released in 2016, just after the decision by the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea that essentially quashed Chinese maritime claims in the region. And China's very forceful rejection of that decision, which I think surprised a lot of folk in the area. And then Trump, looking for a strategy because he didn't have one, basically adopted the Japanese strategy wholesale. But then you have different expressions of the Indo-Pacific. Nathalie has talked about piracy in the Western Indian Ocean. A lot of Australians wouldn't consider that part of the world to be the Indo-Pacific. I went to a series of seminars on the Indo-Pacific in Paris, and it was all about that region. There were a lot of people there from Kenya and Tanzania and whatnot. And Australia and other countries, Japan I think included, see the Indo-Pacific as ending somewhere down the middle of the Indian Ocean. So it's kind of, I guess, sociolinguists might call it a bit of an empty signifier, right? You can kind of make it what you want it to mean, or there is, I think.
But let's consider the way NATO is looking at this, and there's a very good question on Slido. Please contribute any questions if you have them. We'll take some in the room shortly. Because NATO's IP4 definition is New Zealand, Japan, Korea and Australia. Now, New Zealand doesn't have a great military capability that we're talking about. Is this a good enough reflection of what the Indo-Pacific is in terms of collaborating with NATO?
Yeah, look, as I said, I don't think that, what I was implying, I think, before is that I don't think NATO is necessarily a useful tool for European interests if you're talking about engaging with the region. I think the EU is a better institution for that. So the question sort of implies that NATO should have a presence in the Indo-Pacific, but NATO is a North Atlantic treaty organization, right? It's on the tin. I think, yes, as I said, there are areas that are not directly related to, let's say, the balance of power in the region. As I said, cybersecurity, countering misinformation, and it's really focusing on it as the Indo-Pacific partners gives it that sort of geostrategic flavour that I don't think is quite appropriate, to be honest.
Pavel, you wanted to come in there?
Yeah, I wanted just to continue to come back to Theresa's point on two elephants I really liked a lot. So the point was that we have NATO and EU that are approaching these issues, but from a very different viewpoint. And I think that is an example that we should pay attention to. Because if United States administration tries to push back some Chinese technologies out of its critical infrastructure, we see that these cheap solutions with disregard to intimacy, privacy, or other fundamental freedoms that we have in our constitutions in Europe are at lower cost directed from United States to European market. And if we accept this, because it is a cheap solution and we have a common market and it is something that people like to buy, we risk to produce a divergence in security terms, disabling a close cooperation between the United States and European member states of NATO. And I think that this is so connected that we shouldn't just speak about market or common market or single market in Europe without speaking about this transatlantic security viewpoint. And I think that this is something that in our own interest we should develop, that these two elephants cooperate together, speak each other, and take seriously, for instance, the last strategic document by NATO that is also something that European member states of NATO should stick to. And I think that it would impact also our ability to cooperate more with Indo-Pacific countries, which are cherishing the same values, I mean freedom or democracy and so on, the rule of law, first of all.
Nathalie, I think one of the problems I observe about Europe is you talk a nice game in terms of these values and human rights and things, but when it comes to putting your money where your mouth is, for example, trade deals, you're nowhere to be seen.
Well, yes and no. But trade deals, for some time in Europe, the idea was that any sort of trade deal was good, because trade was good, and because trade would promote democracy. We learned the hard way it was not the case. And we learned the hard way that we have to make sure that any trade deal protects our interests. We are the
but
last.
you couldn't get a trade deal with Australia. We're a democratic country. Last time I checked.
Absolutely. But the question of our own interests is relevant, even with our best allies. Our trade deficits don't come from a trade agreement. So some political parties in Europe believe that free trade has to be fought against and that protectionism is the good answer. Of course not. But the way we used to see trade as always beneficial has become something that we believe in, and we are the last believers in a church which emptied. Does China abide by the rules? No. Does the US abide by the rules? Not really.
What if we talk not about free trade, but friendshoring?
Well, first, we were able to conclude and to adopt a trade agreement with New Zealand, which means that we are not that
I think
bad.
Bryce has some views which we'll come to on
Okay,
this.
yes, we are slow, and yes, we are asking ourselves some questions. And I'm in favor of more trade agreements when they are beneficial and when they don't put pressure on the same sectors of our citizens, be it farmers or manufacturers. But the question you are asking is extremely important because the EU has tools that NATO doesn't have.
Yes.
That is to say, commercial relations. That is to say, investment agreements. And you remember that the EU had started negotiating a investment promotion agreement with China, and that it was stopped because we wanted to have more assurances that China would be going in the right direction in terms of labor laws. And of course, we had no assurances at all. So these are tools that we can use. We have to agree about them. We have to pick up our priorities. Sometimes people will tell you it's Mercosur, it's South America, it's so important. Others will tell you, well, let's focus on our neighborhood because we want to have them closer to us, so we need to do more. We have the huge challenge of accession process of Ukraine with some impact on farmers, for instance. So we cannot swallow everything in a minute. But I am definitely in favor of going further with partners like Australia, and not necessarily, and I know it's the provocative part of my speech, only with democratic countries. I remember the discussions we had about Vietnam, and a number of members of the European Parliament were saying, how can you decide to conclude an agreement with a country which is not democratic? Thank you, we noticed. But do we only want to speak to a very small number of countries because they look like what we think we are? Or do we want to have partnerships and alliances with countries considering that at least they don't threaten us, they don't go after us, and they are probably not comfortable being stuck in a region where China is so powerful? I think it's important. I think we have to do it. You didn't mention it because, of course, if we start with definition of Indo-Pacific, we have the whole weekend to discuss about it. But Asian countries are key to our discussions about Indo-Pacific. And I think the EU is not the wrong organization to have discussions with ASEAN. But then we have to put our money where our mouth is. And it's not only trade, it's also what we called, sort of pretentiously, global gateways. We even pretended that we would compete with the Belt and Road Initiative, which is not the case. But there are things that we could put together. Development assistance, investment, private and public money, to make sure that we are consistent and also to make sure that we better communicate, because actually we do quite a number of things, but nobody knows.
Bryce, you had a sharp intake of breath when Nathalie mentioned that New Zealand free trade agreement. For the benefit of the room, was that welcomed in New Zealand, that trade agreement that the EU so graciously granted?
Look, I won't directly answer that question, but look, the EU-New Zealand free trade agreement is sort of held up as a model to other countries like Australia and others around the region, as what they should be doing in order to engage with the EU. There was New Zealand is in a sort of special position. Obviously, it's got a smaller market than countries like Australia, but also in the 80s and 90s, it went through a series of neoliberal reforms and got rid of a lot of its trade tariffs anyway. So it doesn't have much bargaining leverage in free trade agreements. And the criticism of that free trade agreement is that it offered barely any access to New Zealand agricultural products. And of course, New Zealand is an agricultural power. That's what it does. So others around the region are looking at this free trade agreement as a sort of example of how hard-nosed the Europeans can be when they are negotiating on trade. There are also aspects to the agreement that I think came as a surprise to New Zealanders. Apparently, they have signed up to without knowing it, I think, to the EU's reforestation agenda. And this commits them to replanting trees when they chop them down and send them to the EU, essentially. And there are all sorts of questions about compliance that the New Zealanders have. Meanwhile, the New Zealanders have their own scheme for replanting trees, and they're doing it at a much faster rate than the Europeans are. But the problem that the Europeans have is that they don't comply with the regulations that some committee in Brussels has devised and thinks is good. And I think that's kind of instructive. It seems a bit arcane, but the way that Europe is therefore seen around the region is as an actor that wants to impose its rules and standards in areas that don't really make sense to the countries where those rules and standards are being imposed. And sometimes in the New Zealand sense, it's kind of a sort of rational appreciation of what's good policy, but sometimes it comes with a harder edge. I was at a conference just before this where we were talking about geoeconomics, and there were people from all around the world. And it was sponsored by a European institution, and so a lot of the talk was about Europe, and words like neo-colonialism or neo-imperialism were being used for this sort of imposition of European rules and standards, standards that are created democratically in Europe for a European population, but then exported to other places in a fundamentally, I guess, undemocratic fashion.
Could we have a show of hands if there are any questions in the room? Great. We'll get some microphones over to the two gentlemen here in a second. Theresa, I can see you jotting down some notes. Did you want to come back on any of those points?
Yes, I understand, and I don't want to be negative because we have to promote, these things. It's a period of war, but when I used to get invited to the Chinese embassy, you walk in and there's a giant black and white photograph of an EU official. I won't say his name, but he's retired now. And the Chinese didn't give him the award until he was retired. And he was given a giant gold medal for what? While he was an official in Beijing, his job was to transfer technology to China. And there was no... That was his job. So he was really good official. He just transferred lots and lots and lots of technology. And he told me, wow, these Americans were like following me around to find out what I was up to. And I thought, yeah, I bet they were. But, this is kind of like this lack of a threat assessment. It's not commonly shared. And I think that there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. And at the opening of the conference, they talked about inertia. Now everyone's tapping themselves on the back saying, Europe, the EU project is considered a peace project, and they took their peace fund and they're buying weapons. So that was a big move for them. So we have to give credit where credit is due, but there is still a long way to go. And the other thing is, I think the IP4, I mean, back in 2022 in Madrid, it was the first time they showed up, and there was a lot of reluctance to have them there, to have the Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand show up. But I think now it's becoming more and more accepted. So it's like moving a giant aircraft carrier, and you have to work with so many countries and get everyone aligned. It takes time, but we have to continue focusing on what's important. These changes won't happen overnight, but there really is a need to move more quickly. Okay.
Okay, great. We have a question here, the gentleman there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Marcin Jerzewski, and I'm the head of Taiwan office for the European Value Center for Security Policy. Big thanks to Sinopsis and Globsec for organizing this timely discussion. My question is related somewhat to points raised by Bryce about the perception of norms diffusion and rule-making capacity of the EU and its Indo-Pacific democratic partners as neocolonialism. So we do have these colonial legacies in the Indo-Pacific region as Europeans. So how do we put in place restorative justice mechanisms to ensure that we regain the trust in the societies that suffered from European colonialism? That legacy was mentioned famously, for example, by Anna-Lena Baerbock during her historic visit to Palau. But how do we scale it up, and how do we put our money where our mouth is with post-colonial reconciliation? Thank you.
Nathalie, I think that might be one for you.
Might be or might not be, because of course it's quite trendy to say, okay, let's blame new generations for what older generations did. Actually, I'm not that young, but I was born after all the independences of colonial territories, so I don't feel responsible for what happened before. I think a number of countries are using this pretext in order to explain to their fellow citizens the mistakes of their own leaders, be it in Africa or elsewhere. They try to victimize themselves and say, well, we are not developing just because we used to be colonized.
So do you think there is, to his question, do you think there is a case for going out with a restorative justice message mechanism, or you think this is something that can be dealt with as is?
I'm doubtful that it will create positive relations for the future. I'm putting it quite bluntly. But a number of our countries manage their own development and find their place in the world without going to these views of the past. I think we in Europe and in the West generally, to refresh our view of the world. The West is not the center of the world anymore. There is no center in this current world. I don't believe in global South either, because just show me an Indian leader with a Pakistani leader and tell me what they agree about. And normally it ends up the conversation. There is no center. Nobody has to impose its views. But I strongly dispute the idea that, for instance, advocating for reforestation would be a neo-colonial viewpoint. We have to protect our planet. We are doing quite a lot in Europe. Maybe you don't think we're doing the right way, but we are doing much more than most of the other continents. We live in the same planet. We would like that people living in the same planet are doing the same efforts. They don't have to sign an agreement with us. But if they want to, well, let's put things on the table. It will not come naturally. A number of things will not come naturally. They will come if there are rules. We know it within Europe. And if you think we are neo-colonial, have a discussion with Chinese or Russians or Turks and go back to us.
The gentleman here has a question on the end. Thank you.
I'm Lobsang Sangye. I'm presently a lecturer at Harvard Law School, but I used to be a Prime Minister of Tibetan Government Exile. Some of us know each other. My simple question is, if there is war in Asia, let's say over Taiwan or Himalayan region of India or even Philippines, will EU and NATO get involved? Because, when there's war in Ukraine, Europe says this is war of the world. We have to defend democracy and freedom. Now, if there's war in any of the democratic countries, will EU recognize that as war of the world and to defend democracy and freedom? Why I say this is because Theresa said Putin and Xi Jinping gets along very well. The war in Ukraine is sustained primarily because China is supporting in many ways. But then when Macron goes to China and says, oh, Taiwan is America's problem, not European problem, then it flips the narrative that Ukraine war or war in Europe is world war, but war in Asia is not Europe's business.
Okay, let's put that to the panel. Pavel, would you like to take that?
Thank you for your trust. The allusion that you make about the declaration by Emmanuel Macron when he was about to leave the Chinese airspace, and he spoke about in these terms, was for me completely unacceptable, shocking, and I was really very much outspoken to demonstrate that this is completely nonsense to repeat red lines imposed by Beijing. I think that this is the worst we could do in Western free world if we keep repeating Chinese red lines without putting on the table our own red lines. This is the pain that we have to deploy in order to understand ourselves first and explain it to our citizens that there are some red lines also for us. And I think that this is the role for our leaders, for our parliaments, to pay attention to this. If we don't, we will only reinforce Beijing point. And Emmanuel Macron unfortunately did this. And concerning your first question, if there is a war, I think that this is so complex, and the responsibility of those who should put it on the vote and decide it with the approval of Parliament is such that we cannot just take it easily. We have to understand what is at stake and what kind of conflict we speak about. Czech Republic is not a maritime power. If you see our capabilities in terms of airlift, we are not. We are relying on a big ones, and then we have to anticipate the huge journey that we have to take together in order to understand what is at stake. But I am sure that we are interconnected. It was my first point. Not only in terms of our prosperity, but also in terms of our security. And this is the reason why we have to pay attention to the condition of Tibet, to the tension around your identity and your future. And this is something that we have to be extremely sensitive to.
Okay, we have 60 seconds left, and we have Nathalie and Theresa. You have 30 seconds each. Go.
Thank you for that.
I will be very brief,
Okay.
just to echo what Pavel said. I will not defend the words of Emmanuel Macron because I was shocked myself. But France is a maritime power. And at the very moment he had this disappointing speech, the only European vessel cruising in the Taiwan Strait was a French Navy vessel. So for once, our deeds were better than our words.
Theresa.
Okay. Thank you for that excellent question. And this brings up the point about living our values. I mean, you don't put on values like it's a piece of jewelry. And I think the fact that we don't even know what all of Macron said because the Élysée forced the reporters to retract. So he said things that were even worse. And I think Taiwan was so frustrated by this, he had to write a handwritten note, I was told, and it was delivered to Taipei. So I think that this magnifies that Europe does not have a China policy. We have people talking all over the place. We have Macron throwing Taiwan under the bus. And at this conference 2 years ago, it was Indian's Prime Minister Jai Shankar who said to an audience that might not have liked to hear it, but he was absolutely right. Europeans think that their problems are all the world's, but anyone else, it's their problem. So I think that Europe really needs to step up and come up with some common threat assessment. I know it's always the lowest common denominator of 27 EU member states, and you have Hungary, who is very pro-China, pro-Russia. You have problems with Slovakia now. We're seeing a really fragmented strategic landscape, and this is China's dream. So if we want to see a European response, China, it was great. They had this spy case with Kreilman, a Belgian retired senator, and it said right there on the phone, our job, we're trying to break the transatlantic alliance. So that's China's #1 strategy, to drive a wedge. And so it's hard, but it's like herding cats all the time. So I think that the stakes are extremely high, and VW has a plant right next to camps in Xinjiang. How is that living your values? Even people who were German employees would not sign off on the audit. They said, this is wrong, what we're doing here. So we need more people to stand up for that and not just look at financial issues, but also to see the bigger picture and not just what's going on in their own neighborhood. And I think this pointed out like how Japan wanted to have this like NATO office, but all it would have been like some pamphlets and a laptop. And they had one in Moscow, for heaven's sake. And who banned that? Macron. So he was in Xi Jinping's force field, and man, that guy had a big influence on him. And you should go online and see the video that Macron's people created after his visit. It was like high-stepping, beautiful Chinese PLA soldiers, and it was like the weirdest video. So I just think he had a very distorted view, and I think his idea is the third way, we'll come up with a third way. But this is the idea constantly of trying to divide Europe. And who speaks more about strategic autonomy more than Macron? Xi Jinping. It's his favorite go-to phrase. So let's get our act together, let's put our money where it should be, and we're gonna have to make some hard and tough decisions and pull together, and don't let China and Russia divide us further.
And that's where we conclude our panel. Please put your hands together for our wonderful panelists this morning. Thank you very much. We're going to have a short coffee break now, but please be back in your seats here, 11:05. The next session is priorities for the new European Commission here on this stage. Thank you very much for coming.